A record set 62 years ago is about to be erased today, and the only man who can stop it is the one nobody at the range believes is even a shooter. The official said it to Grady Tanner and not to Clyde Waddell, though Clyde was close enough to hear every word of it, which was likely the point. Get the old man in the barn coat off the firing line before he holds up the broadcast schedule. He said it the way a man reads a line off a clipboard he has already stopped thinking about, eyes on his watch, chin toward the tent flap, as if the folding chair 30 feet away held a coat rack and not a person. Behind them, bolted to a plywood frame gone silver with weather, the scoreboard for the Hickory Flat Long-Range Invitational still carried a line nobody had bothered to read in years. 1963, a distance, a group size that looked like a typo to anyone under 40, and a name reduced by sun and rifle oil to a smear of paint. Grady looked at the old man. He looked at the scoreboard. He did not yet understand that they were the same fact, told twice. If you know a record that was never supposed to be forgotten, you already understand why Clyde came back one more time. He had not planned on saying anything. He had planned, that morning, on drinking Margaret's coffee, folding his chair into the truck bed, and watching young men with rifles that cost more than his first house shoot at steel a half-mile off, admiring it the way a man admires a trade he no longer practices but has never stopped loving. The dismissal did not wound him. It barely reached him. 82 years teaches a man which words are meant for him and which are meant for the room, and this one, tossed sideways past his ear, was meant for the room. He kept his eyes on the flags. Grady did not move right away. 6 months into the job, he had learned the run of show card better than his own service record, and nothing on it accounted for an old man in a barn coat who had said 4 words all morning and none of them to complain. "He's not in anybody's way," Grady said, and the official didn't answer, already moving off toward the announcer's stand, already done with the sentence and the man it had been spoken about. The morning carried on the way. Mornings at a match do. Trucks backing trailers of rifle cases across gravel, a generator coughing awake behind the broadcast tent, a line of shooters checking wind flags with the studied calm of men who have paid a great deal of money to look unbothered. Above it all, the scoreboard held its silence, the way old things do when nobody has asked them a question in a long time. 62 years is not a number people keep in their heads at a modern match. It is a number that sits on a board and gathers dust and gets photographed, occasionally, by someone who thinks the font is charming. No one at Hickory Flat that morning could have told you the name under the paint chips, and fewer still could have told you it belonged to the man now being asked, indirectly, to leave. Clyde had heard men talk about him in the third person before, range officers who assumed a folding chair meant a spectator, doctors who spoke past him to Margaret about his shoulder as though the shoulder had wandered in without him attached to it. He had built, across 8 decades, a considerable patience for being seen as furniture. It cost him nothing to sit still under it. What it cost, more precisely, was owed to somebody else. A scoreboard, a name, a year. And he had not yet decided, watching the flags lift and settle over the berm, whether today was the day that account came due. Clyde kept a folding chair the color of an old bruise, aluminum legs gone soft at the rivets, and he set it at the same spot along the spectator line every year, without being told where the spectator line was. His barn coat had faded past whatever color it started as, into the color of the short grass itself, canvas gone the pale brown of late summer, and under it, Margaret had laid out a pressed western shirt that morning, the way she had laid out his clothes most mornings for 58 years, without asking whether he needed her to. He did not raise his right shoulder past the height of his own collarbone. He had not been able to for 11 years, and rather than fight the limitation, he had simply built his whole way of sitting, standing, and someday shooting around it, the same patient accommodation a river makes around a boulder it cannot move. In the left pocket of the barn coat, wrapped in a scrap of flannel gone soft with handling, rode a piece of steel, no bigger than a shotgun shell. He did not take it out. He rarely did, in public. It had been filed by his own hand in a Quonset hut in 1967, a headspace gauge cut to a tolerance the issued gauges of that year could not always promise. and it had trued more than one gun crew's weapon when supply had run short and men's lives had run on schedules that did not wait for parts. He carried it now the way another man might carry a coin he no longer spent, its value long since moved from the vault and into the pocket. A phone buzzed against his knee, borrowed for the day from Grady, who had walked it over without comment an hour before, saying only that his wife had the number if he needed to reach her. Margaret's voice came through thin and familiar. "You eat the biscuit I put in there, or is it still wrapped in the napkin?" He told her he had. She did not believe him, and said so, and told him there was more in the truck bed cooler if his stomach started up, and asked, the way she had asked at 40 matches and reunions and doctor's appointments before this one, whether his shoulder was behaving itself in the heat. He said it was fine. It was not entirely fine. She knew that too, and let it go, because 58 years teaches a woman which battles are worth the phone minutes. When the call ended, he set the paper coffee cup Margaret had packed him down on the bench beside the chair, and he set it at a particular angle, handle turned exactly toward his right hand, though his right hand would not be the one to lift it, base aligned along a seam in the wood grain, as if the placement mattered to some ledger only he kept. He did this at every match, every year, without a word to anyone about why. The cup turned just so before he ever took a sip from it, a small private geometry that asked nothing of the world and explained nothing to it. Around him, the morning built toward its noise. Younger men in performance sunglasses walked past with rifles slung the way soldiers no longer sling them, all bipod and rail and glass the size of a coffee can, murmuring windage corrections to phones that answered back in decimals. None of them looked at the folding chair twice. He did not mind that either. A man who has spent 40 years reading section corners and property lines off a transit, unpaid and unthanked, for farmers who never once wrote his name down, develops no particular hunger to be noticed. He drank from the coffee cup, finally, once it had sat the correct number of minutes to cool, and watched the flags, and waited, the way he had always waited, for whatever the day actually intended to ask of him. Tanner Prescott ran the Hickory Flat Invitational off a laminated card he checked against his watch every few minutes, the plastic gone soft and rounded at the corners from a season of pocketware, a schedule of heats and sponsor reads, and camera cues, typed small enough that he had to tip it toward the light to read his own next line. He was 34, built like a man who had once played a sport seriously and now mostly ran a business, and he wore the particular confidence of someone who has never had to ask twice for anything. His voice, when the live stream camera found him between heats, took on a different register entirely, warm and quick, pitched for an audience he could feel but not see. "Folks, we've got some exhibition-era ghosts haunting our record board today," he said, grinning at the lens, tapping the laminated card once against his palm for punctuation. 1963. Different rifle, different rules. Honestly, probably a different sport. We keep it up there for nostalgia. Wouldn't want the old-timers to think we forgot them. A ripple of laughter came off the crowd near the tent, easy and unmeant to wound, the kind of laughter a joke earns when nobody in it has thought to ask who the old-timers actually are. Clyde was 15 feet away at the time, waved past the shooter's tent by a volunteer checking credentials against a clipboard, told without much interest that spectator passes did not grant access past the rope. He nodded and stepped back. He was waved past a second time 20 minutes later by a different volunteer, this one younger, who looked at the barn coat and the folding chair under his arm and made the same quiet arithmetic the first one had, and Clyde accepted that too, without argument, the way a man accepts weather. It was the MC, mid-transition between two real heats, with a lull to fill and a crowd to keep warm, who spotted the old man standing near the rope with nothing better to do and decided he made good filler. "We need a little comic relief while they reset targets," he called out, half to Prescott, half to the microphone. "Somebody get Grandpa a rifle." Prescott laughed along, waved a hand toward the equipment table, and a rifle came out that belonged to nobody in particular, a mismatched loner with a scope ring somebody had swapped in a hurry, meant as a beat of gentle theater between the sponsor's real business. Clyde took the rifle when it was offered. He did not correct anyone's tone. He turned it over once in his hands, the way a man checks a used tool for a story before he checks it for a fault, and said nothing about the mismatched ring or the stock length or the fact that it had clearly been assembled by 3 different owners across 3 different decades. Prescott, still facing the camera, said something about letting the legend have his moment, and the phrase went past Clyde the way the earlier one had, aimed at the lens and not at him, a joke built for an audience that did not yet know it was about to stop laughing. Grady watched the handoff from the equipment table and felt something small and specific catch in his chest, though he could not yet have named it. It was not sympathy exactly. It was closer to the sensation of watching someone hand a stranger a violin as a joke, and noticing, only after the fact, that the stranger's hands already knew where the strings were before he touched them. Clyde settled into the folding chair with the borrowed rifle across his knees and said nothing to the MC, nothing to Prescott, nothing to the small ripple of amusement still moving through the nearer rows of the crowd. He looked instead toward the row of wind flags strung along the berm, 5 of them at staggered distances, each one telling a slightly different lie about the air between here and the target, and he began, without any announcement that he was doing so, to read them. The younger shooters around him worked a different instrument entirely. Phones and dedicated ballistic units glowed in gloved hands, fed corrected air density, station pressure, a wind call punched in as a single number that assumed the whole half-mile of shortgrass moved as one obedient body. Clyde watched the nearest flag lift, hold, and drop half a beat before the second flag caught the same gust, and understood, the way a man understands his own handwriting, that the air over that ground moved in at least 3 separate arguments, not one, and that a single number typed into a screen could not settle an argument it had never heard. He watched the mirage too, the shimmer rising off the baked clay between the 200 and 400 markers, boiling faster than it had an hour before, and read in its lean the exact direction the surface wind wanted to run before it ever reached a flag. None of this, he said aloud. He simply watched, hands still, the way another man might watch a fire he had built and trusted to keep its own manners. It was his hands that Grady noticed first, not his eyes. Clyde ran the borrowed rifle's bolt open and closed twice, slow, unhurried, thumb finding a checkering pattern that was not on this rifle but on some other rifle decades gone, the motion arriving a half-second ahead of where the bolt actually was, as though his hands remembered a weapon this one was only pretending to be. He seated a dummy round, worked the bolt closed, and paused with 2 fingers resting along the receiver in a stillness that had nothing to do with hesitation. Grady had spent 6 months at Hickory Flat, watching shooters handle rifles the way men handle equipment they respect, but do not know intimately, checking labels, reading manuals off phone screens, trusting a machine to tell them what their own hands should have told them years ago. He had never, in that 6 months, watched a pair of hands move, like they were reciting something learned so long ago, the words themselves had worn away, and left only the shape of the sentence. He drifted closer, not urgently, telling himself he was only checking the equipment table, and stood near enough to watch Clyde's offhand come to rest against the rifle's forend, at a spot that was not where the rifle's own balance point sat, but close to where a much older, much heavier rifle's balance point would have sat, an inherited habit fitted onto borrowed steel. It did not fit exactly. Clyde adjusted for it without appearing to adjust for anything, the low shoulder taking the stock at an angle that looked, to Grady's eye, less like compensation and more like a decision made calmly, years before Grady had been born. "You've done this before," Grady said, quiet enough that it was not quite a question, and not quite for the crowd's benefit. Clyde did not look up from the flags. "Once or twice," he said, and the understatement landed with no weight behind it at all, which was somehow the thing that made Grady go very still and start, for the first time that morning, actually watching the old man instead of glancing past him. The calibrated headspace gauge that belonged to the range's own equipment table had gone out an hour earlier with a technician troubleshooting a sponsor's demonstration rifle 2 bays down, and word came back through a volunteer that it would not return before the next heat. Somebody suggested skipping the check. Somebody else suggested waiting. Clyde reached into the left pocket of his barn coat, unwrapped the flannel cloth with the unhurried economy of a man performing a task he has performed 10,000 times, and set his own gauge down on the bench beside the paper coffee cup, angled the same exact way the cup had been angled that morning, though this time the reason was not hidden at all. The stamp on its side read a service number worn smooth at the edges by 6 decades of handling, and Grady, closest to it, read it twice before looking up. Clyde worked the borrowed rifle's bolt free, seated the gauge, felt for the resistance a properly headspace chamber gives back and a loose one does not, made one small adjustment to the extractor with a tool no bigger than a folding knife, and repeated the check. He did this the way another man checks a level against a door frame, without ceremony, trusting the tool, because he had built the tool himself and knew exactly what it would and would not lie about. "Range is live in 3, the officer called, and Clyde rose from the folding chair the way a man rises who has planned his knees' cooperation in advance, low shoulder, tucking the rifle's stock into a pocket of muscle memory built for a heavier gun, cheek finding the comb at an angle that did not match the rifle's factory geometry and did not need to. He fired 3 rounds. Between each one he did nothing that resembled hurry. Bolt back. Brass caught, rather than let fall. A half-breath held and released before the second shot. No glance at a phone. No borrowed wind call. Only the flags and the mirage, and whatever ledger he kept behind his eyes. The third shot left the borrowed rifle's muzzle, and the electronic target, 400 yards downrange, logged its data before the sound of the shot had finished rolling back across the berm. The scoring monitor blinked amber, then a small red flag lit beside the group size. The software's way of saying the numbers in front of it did not match any group size its own model considered possible from a rifle of this class, at this range, without mechanical assistance. A technician leaned in, tapped the screen twice, and said, loud enough to travel, that the system wanted a manual recheck before it would post an official number, because as far as its own programming understood the world, 3 shots from an unbraced elderly man using a mismatched loaner rifle could not print a group that tight without a machine rest doing the holding. The livestream feed, mid-sentence on some other topic, cut hard back to the firing line. Prescott's laminated card had nothing typed on it for this moment at all, and for the first time all morning, his eyes left his watch. Prescott recovered his footing faster than the software had recovered its confidence. He walked to the firing line with the easy stride of a man who has never yet met a problem his run-of-show card couldn't absorb, laminated card still in hand, though nothing on it applied anymore, and told the camera, with a grin 1 degree tighter than the last one, that they'd sort the equipment glitch after the broadcast, a formality, nothing to worry the sponsors about. Then he sent a runner to the record archive, and the runner came back inside 4 minutes with a printed sheet that Prescott held up for the crowd like a hand of cards he'd been saving. "There it is," he said, tapping the page. 1963 record was set, with a round that got discontinued from competition specification back in the 80s. Case dimensions don't match anything we certify today. Rules are rules, folks. I don't make them, I just enforce them. That record's been sitting up there unofficial for 40 years. Somebody should have taken it down a long time ago. He said it warmly, almost kindly, the tone of a man doing everyone a favor by finally admitting an inconvenient truth, and a portion of the crowd nodded along because it sounded, spoken that way, entirely reasonable. Clyde stood at the firing line with the borrowed rifle still cradled in the crook of his low shoulder and said nothing to the printed sheet at all. He had not come to argue paper with a man who trusted paper more than flags. "Closing ceremony broadcast goes out in 4 hours, Prescott went on, checking his watch as if the number needed confirming, though everyone could see it plainly enough on the tent's own countdown clock. We'll crown this year's winner as the new all-time record, since the old one's just been formally retired as unofficial. Clean slate, good story for the cameras, honestly. Nothing wrong with a fresh start." He smiled at the lens, the way he'd smiled at the exhibition-era Ghosts line that morning. The same performance, pitched for the same invisible audience, except this time, a few of the younger shooters near the rope had stopped smiling back. Grady, standing near enough to have watched the gauge go into the bolt an hour before, said only, "Discontinued for competition, not discontinued because it was wrong." Prescott did not appear to hear him, already turning back toward the broadcast tent, already 3 sentences into his next transition, the printed sheet folded once and tucked under his arm like a settled matter. Clyde set the borrowed rifle down across the bench, beside the coffee cup, beside the flannel-wrapped gauge, and looked at none of it with any particular urgency. He had spent 4 decades reading property corners off evidence other men had stopped trusting, fence lines and old survey pins buried under 60 years of grass, and he understood something about paper that Prescott, for all his laminated confidence, did not yet. That a rule written to solve one problem could, with enough patience, be pointed at an entirely different one, and made to look, on the page, exactly like justice. He did not chase after Prescott to say so. He sat back down in the folding chair, hands loose on his knees, and waited, the way he had waited all morning, for the day to finish deciding what it actually wanted from him. Grady did not go looking for the equipment archive out of any plan. He went because the printed sheet in Prescott's hand had a company letterhead running down its margin that did not match the sanctioning body's own stationery, and a 6-month range officer with an unremarkable service record, but a functioning memory for paperwork, noticed that discrepancy, the way a man notices a stitch out of pattern. The archive trailer sat behind the broadcast tent, its cabinet locked with a combination Grady had been given for equipment logs and nothing else, and he told himself, opening it, that he was only checking a serial number. What he found instead was a folder 3 years thick. Correspondence on the same mismatched letterhead, addressed to the sanctioning body's records committee, petitioning, politely, at length, always in the language of housekeeping and standards modernization, to have the 1963 exhibition mark reclassified as unofficial. 3 separate filings, 3 separate years, and each one, when Grady laid the dated cover letters side by side on the trailer's fold-down table, landed within weeks of a sponsorship renewal cycle for Prescott's own company. He read the dates twice, to be sure his eyes weren't building a pattern that wasn't there. They were not. The pattern had built itself years before he was ever hired to walk this range. He carried the folder back toward the firing line at something close to a jog, and arrived just in time to see a junior official, clipboard nowhere in sight but rulebook open to a marked page, informing Clyde that the hand-filed gauge on the bench constituted unauthorized equipment under section provisions Prescott's own company had written into this year's match rules, and that it would need to be surrendered for the remainder of the event pending review. Clyde did not argue. He set his hand, palm down, lightly over the gauge, not gripping it, simply covering it, and said that he understood the rule existed, and that he would wait for someone with the authority to explain which review it was pending. That authority arrived on foot a moment later, having stepped off a truck that had pulled in unannounced 20 minutes earlier. Sloan Fairbanks, retired Marine Corps colonel, now president of the sanctioning body whose name was stitched into every official's jacket on the property, come to preside over the closing ceremony she had no reason yet to expect would need presiding over in this particular way. She crossed toward the disagreement with the unhurried authority of someone who has spent 30 years walking into rooms already tense before she arrived, and she was 3 steps from the bench when she saw the gauge under Clyde's hand and stopped, as though the ground itself had changed under her boot. She did not ask to see it. She reached past the junior official, turned it once in the light without lifting it from Clyde's palm, and read the stamped service number along its side, the way a person reads something they had once memorized, under circumstances they never expected to revisit. For 3 full seconds she said nothing at all, and the junior official, rulebook still open, looked between her face and the gauge and understood, correctly, that whatever review this was pending on had just changed hands entirely. "Where did you get this number?" she said, finally, though her voice already knew, and it was not really a question so much as a formality she needed to hear answered aloud before she trusted her own memory. "Cut it myself," Clyde said. 67. Had a crew short a gauge and a schedule that wouldn't wait for one. 3 sentences, no more. The plainest thing he had said all day, and it landed on Sloan Fairbanks with a weight that made the junior official quietly close his rulebook and take 1 step backward without being told to. The colonel had not planned to say anything before an audience. She had planned to preside, to shake a hand, to read a name off a printed card, and hand over a trophy built for a camera crew and a sponsor's logo, the sum of her duties for the day laid out as plainly as Prescott's laminated schedule. Instead, she stood at the firing line with Clyde's gauge resting in her open palm and let the crowd's low murmur die down on its own before she spoke, because some things could not be said over noise and be believed. In 1979, she said, I was a second lieutenant at a training range, and a weapon I was qualifying on failed its headspace check twice in one morning, and nobody on that detail could tell me whether the fault was the rifle or the gauge they were using to check it. There was a review board scheduled. My career was, by any reasonable measure, about to end quietly in a folder nobody would ever reopen. She held the gauge up, not for effect, simply so the camera could find what her hand was holding. A surveyor came through on unrelated county business, saw the argument, borrowed a gauge he'd filed himself 12 years earlier, and re-zeroed that weapon in under an hour. Told the board the fault was the equipment, not the lieutenant. He was right. I have carried that debt for 46 years without a name to put on it, because he left before anyone thought to ask. She looked at Clyde, and Clyde looked back at her, the way a man looks at a stranger he does not recognize, and a debt he never expected repaid, and said nothing, because he had genuinely forgotten the year and the face and remembered only the fault in the weapon, which was, to him, the only part worth remembering. The rule Mr. Prescott is citing, she went on, turning now toward the tent where Prescott stood very still with the printed sheet no longer raised, reclassifying case dimensions discontinued from competition specification, was written by the Records Committee in the mid-'80s. I pulled the roster an hour ago on an unrelated question and recognized a name on it. Tanner Prescott's father sat on that committee for 6 years. The crowd's murmur changed register entirely, no longer curious, but something closer to alert. The rule that could erase a record set in 1963 was written 20 years later by the family now positioned to profit from erasing it. I do not know if that was foreseen at the time. I know it is true today. Prescott said nothing. His laminated card hung forgotten at his side. Clyde stepped forward once, slow, the low shoulder keeping his posture honest rather than proud, and when he spoke, it was the plainest 3 sentences he had offered all day. Don't need him punished, don't need my name in lights, just need the board corrected and his company's petition pulled, so the next fellow who reads that scoreboard reads something true. He did not raise his voice to say it. He did not need to. The whole firing line had gone quiet enough that even the generator behind the tent seemed to be listening. Tanner Prescott stood at the edge of the firing line with the printed equipment sheet still folded under his arm, and for the first time all day he did not check his watch. The crowd's attention had turned from the scoreboard to him, with a weight he had clearly never rehearsed for, and the laminated run-of-show card in his other hand had nothing typed on it that could answer the question now sitting in front of every camera on the property. He reached into his jacket instead and produced a second folded page. The pending petition Grady's archive folder had already made irrelevant, the one addressed to the Records Committee asking, for a 4th time, that the 1963 mark be struck. He looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something he had once believed was simply good business. Then he tore it once, and again, and set the pieces down on the equipment bench beside Clyde's flannel-wrapped gauge, not as theater, but as the only gesture left that meant anything at all. I built a career on rules I told myself were neutral, he said, to the camera and past it, because it never occurred to me to ask who wrote them, or why. That's on me, not the rule book. He did not ask Clyde's forgiveness in so many words. He simply looked at him, and Clyde looked back, and gave him the smallest nod a man can give and still mean it. The broadcast, which had never actually cut away, carried the correction live. The scoreboard's paint-chipped 1963 line, repainted within the hour, by 2 volunteers with a stencil and a can of enamel, the name beneath it, read aloud for the first time in decades, by an announcer who stumbled slightly over the pronunciation and was gently corrected, live, by Grady standing just off camera. Sloane Fairbanks signed the amended record herself and handed the pen, afterward, not to Prescott and not to the cameras, but to Clyde, who did not take it, saying only that his signature had never been the part that mattered. He didn't come to keep the record, he came to keep it honest, and once it was, he had no further business with it. Months later, on an evening with the floodlights already dark, and the gravel lot nearly empty, Clyde folded his aluminum chair into the truck bed one more time, the ritual no different than it had been for 40 years, before this match had asked anything of him at all. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her sewing tin open on her lap, the same tin she had carried to every match since 1967, and she held her hand out without being asked, and Clyde wrapped the gauge back into its scrap of flannel and set it inside, among spools of thread and a thimble worn thin at one edge, where it had ridden home 100 times before and would ride home 100 times again. He started the truck. The headlights swept once across the darkened range, the scoreboard now unreadable in the dusk, its corrected paint invisible, until morning brought the sun back to it. Margaret closed the sewing tin's lid, the small metal click the only sound in the cab besides the engine, and neither of them said anything more about the day, because there was nothing left in it that needed saying twice. Some records were never about the number. They were about who kept them honest when nobody was counting, and the truck rolled on past the last floodlight, the gauge riding quiet in its cloth, home to nothing but supper and the porch, and another ordinary evening earned the plain way, one true thing at a time.